Welcome to the Man Up God's Way podcast, a show that dives into the real, raw, and relevant issues for men and their faith, life, and community. Now, your host, Jody Burkeen.
Thank you guys for joining us today. This is a one-on-one with Jody Burkeen and Dr. Jason Lee McKinney, and I'm really excited to have this discussion. And Jason, how you doing today, brother?
I'm doing good, man. Doing good. It's good to see your face again.
It's good to see you too. You were one of my professors at Williamson College, and it was one of the first time. So I started late in my life to try to get my degree. And I never had needed a degree, so I've never taken. I took a few college classes when I was 18, 19, but I wanted to do architectural design, so most of my classes were drafting. And then, later on in my life, I give my life to the Lord and then get into ministry and end up starting a church. And the church thought it'd be a really good idea if I went and got my degree and learned a little bit more about theology. And so that's when I joined Williamson and had the privilege of having one of your classes that really kind of rocked my world because it was my first philosophy class. Why don't you explain your first book, Deconstruction of a Disciple, and let's walk through that.
Yeah, Deconstructing Disciples' Doubt. It's basically, it comes from two different places. One is my own struggle with belief. Belief doesn't come easy for me. I'm not someone who my wife has the gift of faith. I wouldn't say I have the gift of faith. And I think obviously all believers have faith, but some people have the gift of faith. I mean, it's listed as a gift for reason. And you can get into does that mean healing or all that? I think on a base level, it just means you kind of believe the Lord, things are just going to generally work out. And then things, you read something and take it as a matter of fact. I don't do that easy. It just does not come natural to me. And so part of my journey was just answering my own questions and my own struggle with doubt. And then being a professor, and then I'm a touring musician, have been for many years, just seeing young people who enter into college or enter into young adulthood with a robust faith, but a faith that was basically hand-fed to them, like a mama bird feeding. And they don't really know how to stand on it intellectually. And when they get and they face the world of academia or the world that just has a different worldview, and it seems like these people are authoritative, that they just don't know how to defend it. And I think that happens. And then if there's like a third thing, I think the church handles doubt really poorly. Right. I think we just don't. Well, that doesn't help anyone. It's like somebody with a broken arm going, well, just ignore the pain. It'll eventually heal. Well, that doesn't work. Right. That doesn't help. So between those three things, I was kind of inspired to talk about my journey and because a lot of times, we all deconstruct all the time. So it's not a dirty word. It's not a curse word. If you've ever changed your theology on any issue ever, you've deconstructed. So if you've I once was pre-tribulation, and now I'm post-tribulation. Then you've deconstructed that. Or I will say even more so, the disciples themselves deconstructed, because Jesus was not the Messiah they were expecting. They're expecting a political or military leader, and he had to deconstruct that worldview for them, because that is not what he came to do. And so out of that's the reason I wrote. And so the book is kind of it's part of my personal stories. Also, I use a lot of pop culture references. I'm a singer-songwriter. I love movies, and I love identifying worldviews. But then it has real deal philosophical. I mean, I'm trained in philosophy on a higher ed level. And so it does talk about the deeper theological issues, but I try to do it in a way that there's at least analogy from my own personal narrative as well as pop culture, so you can understand big words, big philosophical concepts like God being simple, Yeah,
one of the things that I really enjoyed, because I had never had a philosophy class, but yet as an atheist, prior to my salvation, I used a lot of the philosophical reasonings that, kept me from knowing Jesus or wanting to know Jesus. And more importantly, it was my flesh that kept me from, I thought at the time to be able to do whatever I wanted to do and not have any consequences behind those things. And then getting into your class and reading your book and understand, like even seeing some of those, because we went through some of the philosophical arguments that, that were being taught in the secular schools to be used against Christianity. And it gave me, I love what you said a while ago. The church's biggest problem is that when somebody does hide, it's just, don't, but yet if we understood some of those philosophical reasonings that are coming behind not only their doubt, but maybe even their training or teaching in the secular schools, we would be able to combat that a little bit easier. And I know for me, man, just walking through the book and just kind of going through those steps and seeing kind of where I used to be and maybe where I am now, it just really opened my eyes to what I think more of what the world was showing and teaching than anything, because deconstruction is a big deal right now. So in social media, you've got people, I've deconstructed, or I'm deconstructing to this. And then, they don't always talk about the reconstruction that happens from the deconstruction.
Right.
You think there's I'm going to go deconstruct and then I've got to stop. Well, no, there's that reconstruction that happens as well. And you can either go secular or you can go theological. And the church needs to do a better job in that.
Yeah, you're never moving from a worldview to no worldview.
Right.
You're always moving from one worldview to another. And right. I think one of the things I try to challenge is to look at the worldview someone's moving toward when they're deconstructing with just as critical of an eye as the one they're leaving. Oftentimes, people reserve all their criticisms for the worldview they're leaving. Instead of, let's look, if we're going to be fair and we're going to be authentic about it, let's look and criticize both and see which one stands firm.
Wow. So when did you come to know the Lord? And then when did that deconstruction start for you?
Well, I got saved, so to speak, when I was 15.
Right.
It didn't really take hold until I was 17 because I just didn't know anything. I was raised in church with my grandparents. My grandmother's my Sunday school teacher, but my parents were not Christians at the time. My mom is now, but they were not at the time. My dad never was. And so then from when my grandparents got sick when I was about 9 and then passed away, 9 to 15, I didn't have any sort of, in fact, my parents were very fast and loose with the rules. Don't get a girl pregnant and don't get arrested. And those were the two rules. That otherwise, do whatever you want to do. And so I did whatever I wanted to do. And so I got saved at 15, but I didn't really know anything. And so it didn't really take hold on a surrender or discipleship level until I was 17. And then when I was 17, I met someone, a friend of mine, who let me know that it was okay that I had questions, even though I believed it and I was walking. So I almost immediately started to have questions and doubt. That's just me. I'm not a particularly intelligent person, but I am really curious. And so I ask a lot of questions. I was the kid when I was little, everything was why? Why? How come? Why? My mom drove everyone nuts. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Why? Right. So, and just let me know that was okay. So I kind of immediately started to ask questions. And then it wasn't too many years after that somebody in my life told me it was okay. And that's when I really began to grow. I didn't really begin to grow until I realized my questions were okay. That if God was who he said he wasn't afraid or offended by my questions. So I had this ebb and flow between I'm still walking with the Lord, but I also have these existential questions. And it's always been this back and forth thing my whole life. I'd say less so now. But even now I'm wrestling through, I'm writing another book. I'm actually coming out with a devotional book based on my first book. Great. So it sort of breaks down into 42 devotionals, the big philosophical concepts that I talk about in the book, but it does through a theological lens. So there's scripture attached to each concept and then a prayer at the end so that people can go back and know that it's bite size. And also it does actually tie back to biblical principles.
Wow.
But I'm working on a book now on why AI can never be considered a person. And so I got really curious on that, teaching copyright law to bachelor students. So going through what is the necessary condition or conditions to being a person. And I'll just give one little example. Now I don't want to go through the whole thing, but a lot of people here say, well, what makes humans persons is that we're intelligent. Well, okay, let me pull that apart philosophically, because that's what philosophy does. Let's pull this apart. Does that mean someone with Down syndrome is less of a person than me because they're not as intelligent? That seems like a weird place to place person as intelligence. Does that mean a baby is not a person, or someone with dementia is not a person?
Wow.
Or the flip side of that, does that mean that Elon Musk or Jordan Peterson or Bill Gates is more of a person than me? So if intelligence is what we're basing it on, that's a weird variable. That means some of us are more people than other. But and the other thing it does when it comes to AI is, I mean, everyone agrees that here in the next few years, AI will be more intelligent than humans. So then are they more people than humans? So there are these things that people say, what makes a human a person? And if you're not careful, you end up, if you misdefine it, which I think we have in society, we've reduced what humanity is, first to biology and then to self-creation. Well, then we have no grounds not to say AI or people. And if you start giving them rights, where does that lead us? If we're not, and it basically comes down to human exceptionalism. We have to be thinking. So I still haven't stopped.
I was going to say, especially with the way that culture is now, is that we're trying to give sexual rights, not just, so it's only a step to say that AI's got rights later on.
Well, the term is transhumanism.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Or posthumanism. So it is, that those terms are very closely related, because it's making, philosophically, it's making the same move, but so I've never stopped being curious and asking questions. So I don't think there's been there's been times in my life when I've been closer with the Lord and walking stronger, but there was never a point of walking away from me or complete deconstruction. There's also never been a time where I haven't been asking questions. Right.
And, and the Bible tells us we're to be teachable, as leaders and teachers and pastors, elders, so to speak. You have to be teachable and you have to be growing. And I think a lot of times what happens with the church is when, they get to a certain point and they feel like they've got everything figured out, and then that becomes their dogma or their doctrine. And when you look back on it, it was really a tradition instead of a mainline doctrine. Mm-hmm. I've traveled to enough churches doing men's conference through Man Up God's Way that I can tell you that 90% of all churches are ready for the 50s to come back. They haven't changed, or they've always stuck in their same little understanding and the way that the church looks and all of this kind of stuff, and they haven't grown in the grace and knowledge of Jesus. They just kind of get stuck in that place. And so with philosophy, you're able to kind of take that a little bit further and dig deeper. Do you see with philosophy, do you see it being taught correctly in the secular system, or is it being taught to have really, they're really teaching a theology through philosophy that, I will say an atheistic theology, but they're teaching something. And do you see it leaning toward one way or the other? Or are they trying to, let people have open minds? Or are they trying to get people to have a certain thought process?
That's a difficult question that I think there are probably several aspects to. Teaching philosophy incorrectly, I wouldn't say that. But I definitely think many academic institutions make the mistake of teaching the professor's viewpoint instead of laying things out on a table, because academia is supposed to be the marketplace of ideas.
Right.
I would have made a mistake if I only taught the class that I had you with Christian philosophers. If I had only taught you Augustine and Aquinas and Kierkegaard and not taught you the atheist philosophers or the Muslim Avicenna, we talked about him. Right. If I wouldn't have taught you about them, that is intellectually disingenuous. And it is not that you're teaching it wrong, but you're not giving a complete picture. And when it's almost like a lie, not a lie, but it's akin to a lie by omission.
Right.
I'm leaving out certain things. So I think that what I could say is that many secular institutions omit a lot of Christian philosophy, even though from the Greeks in antiquity, obviously they weren't Christians, although they taught some Christian principles. They just didn't know they were Christian principles. From that point forward, the majority of philosophy was Christian all the way up through the modern era. And then the modern era, you start to make this turn towards atheism. So if you take philosophy as a whole, even the Greeks believed in the metaphysical, they believed in the soul. And then you take the next 1700, 1800 years, everyone believed in God. And it's only been in the last couple of hundred years. And so I think that there is you'll hear Soren Kierkegaard taught a lot in secular institutions. And they talk about his existential philosophy, but they never talk about the fact that the man was a devoted Christian. Right. And he himself, so they just omit those parts of his writing. Right. And so I wouldn't say that it's taught incorrectly. I would say that it's taught incompletely on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved because I always want to know what's the antithesis of what I believe. Like if I believe this, what is coming at me from the other side? If I have a philosophical bent, because there's always an argument or a debate or a question that can come from the other side. And if you don't know how to battle that, I always teach the people that I disciple that, I used to be, up until I became a Christian, I was a sales guy and an entrepreneur. And I always had to know my customers or my competitors' products better than I knew my own. And that way I could, combat their faults or what, I at least knew what was coming at me. And, we have an enemy within Christianity supposed to know. And if we don't know that and the things that the world's spewing out there, what's the opposite of what we're teaching, then we really don't know how to battle that. And I think that's a lot of times where that doubt comes in is somebody just said something that sounds really good, but I don't know how to combat it. And I think with philosophy, especially for me, obviously everybody uses philosophy to an extent, whether philosophy at all, but to know, when you went through the secular philosophers and then the Christian philosophers, and it just kind of made, and I started seeing the history of it. It just started making more and more sense to me to be able to say, okay, now I kind of get where they're coming from now. And it actually made me study, a little bit more even after our class, because with discipleship, with debating, or with, dealing with atheists or, social media. We've got the world's largest social media platform for men's ministry, and we get a ton of those goons, coming on there talking about that. So it was really good to have a well-rounded teaching, and man, I really thank you for that. Big time.
Oh, I'm glad that it's, you reach a point in life where you're like, I just hope that something I do affects people in a positive way for the kingdom. And if that's what happens, I'm good with whatever, the grandiose dreams go out the window, or maybe you get humbled by life in a good way that you're like, exactly. I don't need to be up on some huge platform. I just need to know, did I do something good? Can Jesus say, well done, good and faithful servant? That if that's the case, then I'm all right with life.
Right. Exactly. I know I'm the same way. When I launched our church, 10 years ago, I thought, man, in 5 years, we're going to be at 500. In 10 years, we're going to be at 5,000. Like, in my head, I'm thinking, man, this is what God's going to do. He opened the door for this. And you kind of get humbled along the way, and you realize, man, I need to focus on the one. Okay. The one person that's in front of me, maybe two. Let's get the gospel in them. And it's definitely humbling to an extent, but it's also, when God God kind of puts you in that position. You focus on what's in front of you, not what, you think the world wants you to have, kind of deal. So, so you're kind of a Renaissance man. You've written books. You really love philosophy. You're writing against, what I would say AI, the potential that's coming from that. And you're also a singer songwriter with a band too. Tell us a little bit about how all that started.
Well, that was my, it started, my dad, when I was 8 years old, took me to see the movie Purple Rain, which was wildly inappropriate for an 8-year-old to see. And I remember at the end of the movie when Prince played the song Purple Rain, I remember distinctly going, I want to make people feel the way he's making me feel right now.
That was a great clip too. Yes.
And so I didn't know if I could play, if I had any talent. My dad loved music, loved it, but had no ability whatsoever. His rugby team used to, my dad was a rugby player, but they did security for rock concerts. So I was around music. He loved music. And so that's sort of what started it. And I ended up finding that, I wasn't particularly talented, but I was pretty creative.
Right.
That's kind of the same thing. I don't think I'm intelligent. I'm curious. I don't think I'm talented, but I am creative. And so that was the dream. Started playing drums because that's the only thing they would let me play. There was no guitar or bass. So I ended up playing drums in school, and then I became a singer, and I just took off and started, trying to make it a career. And here I am almost 30 years later, still doing it. I head out to Dallas for some corporate gigs in about an hour.
That's awesome. And so is it the Jason Lee McKinney Band? Is that the name of it?
Jason Lee McKinney. It's not the only entity I've been signed with, but it's the one I've done for almost 15 years. And we've toured 5 of the 7 continents. I played shows in Djibouti, Africa, and Poland, Germany, and Kuwait, and all kinds of places, all over the place. And it's an Americana soul band, so it's kind of a Americana. I'm influenced by all like rural poor, like basically music that was made by rural poor people, folk, country, blues, gospel, funk, soul, that kind of stuff. So anything that was made by poor people in America, I'm influenced by that. And we're not a Christian act, although our faith is very prevalent in our stuff. And so, just been doing it a long time. And I thought we maybe wouldn't make any more music, but we're getting ready to come out with some new stuff here this year. So, I guess I have the terminal disease of being creative, whether I want to or not.
How many albums do you guys have?
Oh man, we have 12 studio and 1 live album. And then we're starting to putting out singles that will end up being an album. So we're working on studio album number 13.
That is awesome. Yeah. When I found out that you had, because at the end of like each chapter of your book, didn't you have like a QR code to be able to go listen? Yeah, exactly. Like I was trying to think of that. That's what it was. Go listen to the song and listen to the lyrics, and that's what drew me to your music, is because I'm a lyrics guy. Like I love the lyrics have to move me. I love all the grunge. I grew up in the grunge phase, and just man, all the grunge is. For some reason, their lyrics are some of the best. For some reason, I guess maybe that's just because of the era I was in. But I love your lyrics are really they're deep. They go a little bit deeper than most lyrics do, and I like that a lot.
I appreciate that. I got a new song where I'm quoting from the Valley of Vision, which is the 17th century Puritan devotional series. So I don't know how many people have a gospel funk blues song that's quoting from 17th century Puritan. Right. Here I am doing it.
Wow. So like, do you think of like, is it like your thought process? Do you go, man, how funky can I make this? Or is it just kind of like, does it just pop into your head going, first of all, why would you have read that? The 17th century, whatever that, the devotional.
Reading it for fun. There was a particular phrase that had a cadence to it when I read it, that I sang a melody to it, and it sounded like it would be gospel funk. And so that's what I went with. So So I just started from a singular phrase and a little melody that popped in my head while just reading the book. So
that's crazy. So I had my first experience with writing a song. I did a Wounded Warriors conference, a weekend that we did, and they had there's some it's a group out of Nashville, and I can't think the name of off the top of my head, but they actually go around to veterans and they write songs, and then they literally produce them, and if one just happens to go, it helps out the Wounded Warriors project. So we had
a buddy of mine writes for them, Billy Crane. He used to play the Outlaws, and his brother was Charlie Daniels' guitar player for years.
No kidding. Yeah. So we had I'm a veteran and from the Gulf War, and we had probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 of us in this room, veterans, and the writers. There was 2 writers, one that would pen everything down, then a guitar that would kind of just maybe try to get a key to go, or a note, or whatever, a chord to go with the words that we were writing down. But what they did, and it was really cool, they would ask the first guy, like, what's one thing that you remember from war? And he would say, just loneliness. And the guy would write down loneliness. And they would literally just go around asking everybody. And then by the time we got back around, the guy who's writing the lyrics would have, kind of he goes, well, what do you guys think about this? And somebody go, well, what if you added that? And like, I'm not kidding, the collective. And by, probably 2 hours into it, we had a song and, chords and everything. And then they sang it to the wives also did that. And the veterans did it, and they came together and played those songs. Man, it was such a cool experience. That
awesome.
Just the creative process. I can imagine, what you go through trying to write those songs and be creative like that. We had, 10 guys doing that. I can't imagine doing, just 2 or 3 guys sitting there trying to come up with a song. Is that something that's pretty easy for you?
At times, I mean, there's times that it's work and times that it comes really easy. I tend to know pretty definitively and instinctually what I want to hear. So I do have I hear, when I think of a song, I hear it finished. Okay. So I hear it produced. I hear it like how I want to hear it. And then it's just a matter of taking it from what's in my head and trying to get it out into the world.
Okay. Golly. Yeah. Like for me, I write books as well. And it's for me, I have a season where I don't do anything. And all of a sudden it's like, bam, I've got everything. It just kind of comes out all at once. So I can imagine that's kind of what it's like. So let's dive in your devotional book that's coming out. That's kind of an accompaniment to your first book. Is it ready for release, for sale? Is it purchased?
It's not out yet, but it should be coming out in the next month or so. I'm waiting on a quote from my friend Barnabas. So on the back, that's all I'm waiting is something to slap on the back that says, I told him just say something simple like the deepest theological work since C.S. Lewis and greater than Moby Dick. That's all. Just something simple.
That's all you need. Right. So does it go along with the chapters of your book? Okay.
It does. Right. So it's basically 7 devotions per part of my book. So there's 6 parts of my book, the introduction, and 5 parts. And there's 7. So it's basically for somebody to spend, 6 weeks. It just makes everything a little more easily digestible. It's a little more telling stories, a little more, and it ties it into the theology. So it can be read in a class as a companion book at the same time, or it can be read by somebody who doesn't feel like kind of up to the challenge of my other book, because my other book's pretty deep and it's pretty long. Or someone who's read my book, my first book, and thought, I don't quite get everything. You can go back and read this devotional, and the devotions themselves, instead of spending hours having to read stuff, you can read them in 10 minutes. So
right, exactly. Well, to be honest, your first book, Deconstructing of Disciples' Doubt, to me was not that hard of a read. I'm trying to it was a good read, but trying to put all the philosophical pieces together for me, because I'd never had philosophy. Whatsoever. I'd never heard of Kant, until, you talked about it. None of the other guys. And so for me, that was probably the hardest part, was just trying to put, the pieces together, who was who and when they were, and, what era they were in and stuff like that. But once I got through the book and, each one of the classes, man, it was such an eye-opening. I've actually suggested a couple people in my church read it, who have, this kind of doubt or this kind of, maybe they're a little bit more logical about their reasoning or thinking or something like that. So I've had them read the book as well. So for people, it's not, people listening, it's not that it's extremely deep or academic by any means, because you did a really good job with just, making it to where most people could read it. I think just if you don't understand philosophy, that would be the hardest part.
Right. Yeah, I try to make it digestible, but the devotion is trying to break it down even further. For someone's like, man, I've only got 10 minutes a day or something, but it's, I think makes it a little easier. And like I said, it's a little more, it ties the philosophical concepts to the theology. Right. Where the first book was really written as a philosophy of religion book. This is written more of a theological devotion with the philosophical concepts. Right,
exactly. So what would you suggest to people who are maybe, with the world coming at them 900 miles an hour right now, and social media, basically an atheist platform, with everything. I mean, you watch TikTok or Instagram or any of the reels really quick. There's 30-second to 2-minute clips of somebody just deconstructing the Bible, in ways that sound really, really good. Like, oh my goodness, that sounds really good. What would you tell somebody who has that kind of doubt? Like, where would you tell them to start and just kind of pause for a moment to figure out what they believe? How would you walk somebody through that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, if you're talking about what you're hearing someone say, if I can use an example, when a scientist, so say an evolutionary biologist says, well, we know we're alone in the universe. And a lot of people could look at the credentials and go, oh, well, that's an evolutionary biologist saying that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not their field of study.
Right.
So they're just because somebody, like, it's almost like me, who's an academic doctor, saying, Jody, I think you ought to get your heart checked out.
Right.
That's not my field of study. So why would you take my opinion over your medical doctor?
Right.
So when people make statements outside of their field of study, that is one thing to look at. Another thing is, are they making if it's a scientist, are they making a scientific statement, or are they making a philosophical statement? Mm. So when you're talking about the Bible, like, I've heard people talk about, like, the reasons why Jesus didn't exist, right? And they'll give these really good reasons. He wasn't actually a person. Well, there are many theological professors, professors of theology or doctrine, that are atheists.
Right.
And none of them believe that Jesus wasn't a historical person.
Right.
So if you're taking somebody who's just a random person making a statement, why are you taking that at face value? Why are you, look behind that? Why are they making that statement? Right. That's one of the first things. The other thing is to check yourself. Like, are you having a desire to no longer believe in a biblical worldview? Because if you are, you're going to latch onto things that give you what you want. Right. If it's just like when you first see a girl and you like her, but you're not sure, you're going to talk yourself into, like, I don't really like the way she opens her mouth when she chews gum and she smacks her lips, but you know what? It's kind of cute, actually. But you're talking yourself into it because you like that girl. We do the same thing when we're moving towards a worldview. We give all kinds of excuses to the loopholes in it, when every worldview is going to have a certain amount of uncertainty. Right. And so including Christianity is going to have a certain amount of uncertainty. That's why it's faith, Right. And so I would just say you need to do two moves at the same time. Look at, who is this person saying it? Why are they saying it? And then why do I want to believe it? Right. There's like really a self-examination piece of it too.
Right.
And to be really honest with yourself. I much more respect somebody who says, I just didn't want to believe in Christianity anymore because I felt like it was XYZ. Then someone was like, well, I just became unconvinced of the arguments. Well, maybe that's true, but I think most of the time you wanted to move from that direction before the arguments became unsustainable to you.
Right. So I've been watching, oh gosh, Jordan Peterson, and I think we even talked a little bit in the class, but, watching him deconstruct his, his faith or his understanding of the Bible, I think he was pretty agnostic, for most of his life, even potentially atheist. And he's walking through this process through his understanding of the Word of God and everything. One of the things, if I'm being honest, what I see from him is that he's spending most of his time with academia, trying to understand the Bible instead of, by stepping out in faith. And I don't know that he, again, has either stepped across and said, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and I believe that by faith, and I'm repenting of my sins, or if he's still kind of in that, because he talks, I even went to one of his lectures on his book, gosh, what's the one he's doing now? It was here in St. Louis. Something about God. What was it called?
Oh, I don't know.
He's got a book, is like The Thought of God or The Theory of God or The God Question or something like that. But anyway, it was literally a monologue of him deconstructing his worldview and coming up with a biblical view, but yet never connected Jesus to that. So you have these guys out there like him, and then you see Joe Rogan, and you see a lot of these other people having these. It's like what you said, that it's not in their, that's not their profession, that's not their degree, that's not where they typically spend most of their time in study and understanding, and yet they're still having these kind of conversations. And again, that won't ever go away, but how do you combat the world coming at you like that? Jordan Peterson, man, if he ever truly gives his life to the Lord, and again, like, I don't know if he has or hasn't. I mean, I think he's on that path. It's almost like somebody just hasn't shared the gospel. They just keep going around the historical and the theological and the great big questions, but never just going finally, okay, I believe by faith. How do we combat that as a church, or how do we combat that as Christianity from this lukewarm, biblical worldview, if you will?
Well, I think one I'd say about Peterson and Joe Rogan is that perhaps they're just on their journey. Like, that's part of the reason I structured the book how it is. I start with metaphysics, like, why does anything exist? Why does the universe exist? And then I keep getting more and more narrow until it finally comes down to personal experience.
Right.
And they may just be on their journey and they're not quite down to personal experience yet. But I will say this, just to affirm, Jesus said, when he's talking about the goats and the sheep, apart from me, I never knew you. It's really interesting to me that he doesn't say you never knew me. He says, I never knew you. And so there must be at some point a personal surrendering and an intimate relationship with Jesus as a person. You can't just know. It's great to know all. Like, I think one of the biggest mistakes of the church is that people don't know the history. Like you said, that churches want to be stuck in the 50s, and this is the way we've always done it.
Right.
What's really interesting is that there's many things that weren't always that way, that they think the old time church has always done it this way. It's like, no, that wasn't. The church has been around since Jesus died. There's many ways to do it. And your old time way is pretty new, actually. In the history of the church, it's a couple hundred years old. So, so I think that we could really do with, and you hear silly things like, I would never read Aquinas because he's a Catholic. It's like, well, he lived in 1200. What were the choices?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
He was either Orthodox or Catholic back then. So he was one of them. So I mean, there's just a lot of ignorance like that. But at the same time, you could go the opposite route. So I think it's a mistake to not know all that stuff. It's a mistake to not know philosophy. It's a mistake to not know the church history. But if that's all you know, and you don't know Jesus personally, you've missed the grand point. You've missed the reason to know philosophy. You've missed the reason to know the church history, because the church history is about Jesus and his church.
Amen.
So my first thing is that they may just be on their journey.
Okay.
But the other thing I think I see is, I believe if you line up the Christian worldview with other worldviews, none of them are going to be a closed loop. None of them are not going to have holes in them.
Right.
At least to our own understanding. Now, I don't believe Christianity has holes in it from God's perspective.
Right.
It is the truth, but from our understanding, there's always going to be things like, that didn't quite make any sense to me.
Right, exactly.
But I do believe it holds up sturdier than any other worldview. And I think people like Peterson and Joe Rogan are test cases, and the fact that it does. They're starting to see whether they've crossed that line of faith or not. They're going, wait a minute, this actually makes a lot of sense. And it's starting to reframe, because you hear this argument like, well, the church has been the cause of all these wars, and the church has been, in God's name, there's been all these people killed and stuff. And that's absolutely true. They're absolutely right. But once again, they're leaving out that the only reason we have hospitals is because of the church. Hospitals were started by the Cappadocian Fathers.
Right.
Basil was the first one to start a hospital. Christians started hospitals.
Right.
Christians started schools. Now there was schools in ancient Greece, but the way we do school now, formalized and for children, and the way it's thought about, Christians.
Right.
Yeah. Christians were the first ones to teach women to read and write.
Right.
That started with us. And so, yes, the church has done many atrocities.
Right.
But if you look at what the positive effects on culture that the church, and Peterson talks about this, the positive effects of Christianity versus the negative, I mean, it's 98-2. I mean, the percentage is overwhelming that the church has been a positive influence on the world.
Right.
So I think they're starting to see the sturdiness of the worldview. Now, I don't think that gets them to heaven, but it's certainly, a lot of people are starting to see that, a worldview without God just cannot hold up. I mean, if you think about it, if there is no God and all you are is a biological body, then you aren't a person.
Right.
You're not real.
Right.
You, Jody, we just name this organism.
Right, exactly.
For a reason. So if that's the case, and I say this all the time, all belief systems boil down to there is a God, which means everything means everything.
Mm-hmm.
Or there is no God, which means nothing means anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because if meaning is self-created, it's thin. It can be changed, Right. So I think what Rogan and Peterson are starting to discover is all this stuff that is coming at them is thin. And there's a sturdiness to a Christian worldview that is not thin. Right.
I learned most of my history understanding was probably from Luther up. That's all because I lean more toward a reformist mindset, when it comes to my studies and understanding. And so, I kind of started there and worked my way up. And I didn't even do a deep dive in that prior to going to school. Just my last class, I just got my grade yesterday on my final paper, but it was church history. It was, and it was, it was a deep dive into, from the apostolic church all the way up. And I'm telling you what, it rocked my world. Like and I've had a couple of classes, but nothing like the deep dive that we, take in a master's class. And so my final paper was, because I'm looking at, when I look at the church today, the title of my final paper was, is the church still relevant today? Mm. And, how we can actually look at history and see, God's design and God's plan, even with all the schisms and the screw ups and the man-made problems that came along with it. The church still sustained itself from Jesus's day all the way up until today. And it will continue. We may screw it up here in the United States, but it may blow up in China and India and everywhere else.
It is blowing up in other parts of the world.
I know, yeah, it is. We may see those countries become Christian countries as we decline in our Christianity. And you may see a flip-flop in both the economy and there's so much that could potentially happen there.
Well, there's South American countries who are starting to send missionaries here.
Right. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we are now post-Christianity.
Right. Exactly. And so when I wrote that paper, it was just kind of like, yeah, the church is still relevant today. And, you know, even in our decline, we ought to see that and hopefully have a revival of sorts. I don't know what that would look like. You know, I mean, only God can tell. I mean, we may have already passed that precipice of God's grace, and we're headed to that, you know, to become a slave country. Who knows? I mean, but I think I love what you said, that people need to understand church history. People need to understand philosophy. And I think too often, even within the church, and I'll throw myself under the bus. For years, I didn't think, gosh, you know, and in my Christianity, I kept hearing people debate over doctrines and theologies and all this. I'm thinking, man, it's as simple as the gospel. You know, just preach the gospel. And yes, that's great, but also having the understanding of theologies and doctrines to go along with that. That's when your roots start getting deeper than you know, just, hey, I'm saved. I got one foot in heaven and one foot on earth, and you know, I hope I'm going to get into heaven. Well, let's grow in the grace and knowledge and work out our salvation in fear and trembling, you know, through the understanding of these theologies and these philosophies and these doctrines, in order to build a better base of the church. I mean, Jesus is a great base, but the little bricks that we put on top of that, we can screw it up big time. So
I actually think that the more you know about church history, the more committed to, and the more you see the importance of church unity. You know, exactly. We talk about, you know, like one of the big things is baptism, full immersion or sprinkling, and churches divide over that. But if you read the Didache, which was the first sort of church manual, here's how you do a service. They had a hierarchy.
Right.
It was, and I think I remember the hierarchy. It's, if you can find running water, they didn't mean like running water like from a tap, but like a stream or a river, and it was cold, that's where you should, if that's available, that's where you baptize.
Right.
And then if you can't find that, and you find a stream or a river that's warm, then you can use that. If you can't find that, then you find a full tub of cold water, and then next full tub of warm water. And if you can't find that, then you can sprinkle. So the early church allowed for all of it. There was a hierarchy, and full immersion in cold running water was the first, but they allowed for it. And you study why. Well, these people were evangelizing in deserts.
Right.
So,
right.
So I have to be fully immersed to be saved, and there's no water around for 1,000 miles. Like, you know, so here's the thing, like we split churches over that.
Right. And it amazes me how long children baptisms went up to, you know, until the Anabaptists, you know,
and that's the other thing. We consider Anabaptists as heretics. A lot of people do, but they brought full immersion back.
Full immersion back. Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing about that too is we think, well, that came from Martin Luther. Like, no, Martin Luther wanted to kill the Anabaptists because they wanted to do full immersion. So knowing that church history, just it allows us to go, okay, well, there's room for us to allow these things. And it also really teaches us what the first level importance doctrines are.
Right, exactly.
I think the Nicene Creed, I say this, if you believe in two things, if you can state the Nicene Creed and stand behind all of that, and you can tell me that the Bible is authoritative, then we can lock arms and disagree on everything else, and we're still brothers.
That's good. I like that.
So, you know, but and people think, well, that's just the Nicene Creed's just this little thing, and it's not in the Bible. Well, it predates the canonization of the Bible. It's exactly. Like we canonize, like that was when church leaders were like, here's what it means to be a Christian. Right. You know, the Trinity, the virgin birth, the actual physical death and resurrection of Jesus.
And what's crazy is they weren't adding those things at the Nicene Creed. They were affirming those from the apostolic to 300 years later, because that's what had been taught in the church the whole time, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think if we go back and say, can you and I sit across and say that every point of the Nicene Creed we agree on, and we agree in the authority of Scripture, we got a great starting point. We can argue about pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, and does it really make someone not a Christian if they disagree with me? Is that really a first level importance issue? No. But if they believe that Jesus is one way to heaven and not the only way, well, I can't agree with that. That's a first level importance. Do they believe that Jesus was actually Joseph's biological child? Well, I have an issue with that. I can't believe that. But if they believe that there shouldn't be drums in church, and I think that's silly, that doesn't mean that they're not a believer and I am, or vice versa. That's silliness. So I think that church history helps us define what are the main doctrines of Christianity and what aren't the main doctrines of Christianity. I think we can lock arms with a lot of Catholics. I disagree with a lot of Catholics. I disagree on two fundamental levels with Catholics, and I'll tell you what they are. Papal supremacy.
Right.
I do not believe that if the Bible and the Pope disagree, that you go with the Pope.
Right.
And I know what they would say is, my friends who are Catholic would say, but it's impossible for the Pope and the Bible to disagree because he is God's mouth. And I get that. Right. But there's been some popes throughout history who, had brothels and orgies and stuff that I'm like, I'm not sure he was speaking for God. But there's been some amazing popes too, amazing men of God. And we've had our own in Protestant circles, our own questionable fellows along the ways as well. Yeah. And then I don't believe in the perfection of Mary.
Right.
I believe in that, but I think Protestants make a huge mistake in that we don't venerate or honor Mary enough. If you think about Jesus's first miracle, one of the devotions I write about is that Jesus was a mama's boy.
Right.
Jesus didn't want to do the miracle at the feast. He told her, it's not yet my time. The funny thing about that is typical mom. So she says, Jesus, they're out of wine. Jesus says, why do you bother me with this? It's not my time. And she turns. So that's what Jesus says. He basically says, why are you asking me to do this? Mary doesn't even wait for his reply. She turns to the servant and says, do what he tells you to do. So her assumption is, I'm your mother. You're going to do what I'm asking you to do. And what does Jesus do? He does what his mother asked him to do.
Right.
And then you go to the end of Jesus's life, right before he cried out to the Father. What's the last thing he did? He said, hey, best friend,
John, take care of
my mom.
Yeah.
So I think it's a huge mistake for Protestants in reaction to Catholics over, venerating and over honoring and theologically, I think, being incorrect. Right. I don't think we'd run from Mary and say like, this, because a lot of persons like, let's not talk about Mary. She was just a random woman. It was a lottery ball thing. And God just like, you. No, when the angel came and visited her, said, you are honored amongst women. You were chosen by God. Wow. And she was with him at every point. In fact, there's a lot of theologians who believe that the Gospel of Luke, one of the primary people who were interviewed for that was Mary.
Yeah.
And so, if Luke's like, hey, I need to find out the scoop, I'm going to go to his mom and ask him, ask his mom about it. I think that church history helps us to go, I think it helps us to look, maybe us Protestants don't honor Mary enough. Yeah. I heard a Protestant say one time, I say this in class all the time, that, you know what? All those Catholics talk about Mary. When I get to heaven, I'm knocking Mary out of the way to get to Jesus. And I'm always like, I'm not sure. I'd be knocking Jesus' mom out of the way.
Yeah.
I believe in eternal security, but you might test that theology if knocking Jesus' mom out of the way.
Yeah.
he might invent purgatory just for that occasion.
Right. Exactly. You might just all of a sudden see hell, just boom. Yeah, that's great. Well, man, I could sit and talk to you all day long. I love your thought process and your understanding of both scripture and philosophy. And honestly, man, it kind of rocked my world, having your class and reading your book. And wasn't something I was expecting. As a matter of fact, I was dreading the class because I didn't have any clue of understanding of philosophy. And but I tell you what, it redirected my thought processes, both in my sermons and the way that I disciple people. And It's been a huge help, and I really appreciate that. I'd love to get you back on the podcast once the devotional comes out, and for sure, when the AI book is getting close to being finished, because that's going to be a topic in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think like, why nobody's really asking this question yet, but I think they're going to.
Oh yeah,
The question's going to be, why is an AI a person?
Well, if we continue the lunacy that we're doing right now, I mean, the craziness that's going on. I literally am following a guy. He's a woke pastor in, Northeast somewhere. And he literally said, like, this past Easter, when it just happened to fall on the transgender day, transvision gender day or whatever it was, he came out with a video and said, we need to think of the resurrection not as an actual resurrection, but it's more of a philosophical understanding that the world needs to resurrect itself and its thought process. And we need to, esteem and include all of these transgender people. They're the ones that are, being put up on the cross. And I thought, man, dude, you're going to smoke a turd in hell for that one. And that's the kind of thought process that's happening out in the world, when it comes to this. You've got these.
I would say if there's no physical resurrection, then there is no Christianity.
Right, that's what I was saying. Yeah, exactly.
But Christianity does not exist without the physical death and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, what we're doing and talking about is useless. Yeah.
We're idiots. If that didn't really happen historically,
right? We're
idiots. I mean, so. I would love to come on again. I would and love to talk about, I'll give away the ending of the AI book. It's going to come down to, after a bunch of philosophical and a bunch of pages, what makes a person has to be an embodied soul with a free will. And so when you take an embodied soul, an embodied soul in a human body, an embodied soul with a free will, what is the qualifications for that? That is something that is made in the image of God.
Right.
It is the Imago Dei. That is what makes us a person.
Right.
And that is, so AI can never be a person, because even if AI is an embodied brain, it is made in the image of man.
Right.
We are the only ones made in the image of God.
Amen.
I just gave away the end. Now you don't need to read all the philosophical stuff.
No, I can't wait to read it, because it's going to be a hot topic. I mean, the way that it's, they're relating it to like electricity, like it's that big of a deal of how big of a change it's going to, not only in our culture but in our economics, and it's gonna rock the world if it continues. A lot of
people say it's not that it's going to come and take our lives, like a lot of sci-fi movies, but it's going to come and take our jobs.
Yeah.
And I was talking to students and saying, if there's no need for you to create,
right,
there's no need for you to work your job,
mm-hmm.
then human beings are going to be miserable, because we need meaning.
Yeah.
We need stuff to mean something. Otherwise, so we're going to be lost. Hey, man, I'd also love to come talk to your church or any conference you think I do. I'd love to come and do that. All happen.
Dude, while we were talking, especially on that church history stuff, I do expository preaching. I'm going through the epistles of John right now, and I'll probably finish up in July, August with, I started last July. So it's taken me that long to get through just the three little books there. And I was going to go into Leviticus, but honestly, while we were sitting here talking, I think what I might do is take my church through church history, through a philosophical lens as well. And that's a great idea. I think the Holy Spirit just spoke there, is to maybe have you come in and really kind of start start it off. Maybe, I'm trying to flesh that out. That might be a really good idea because I've had people ask, because I've been talking about, both my philosophical understanding now, and which is still, tadpole shallow, it's just kind of right there in the shallow end, but in that and church history. So that might be a great idea.
I'd love that. That'd be great.
Then we could talk more about that and figure out what that would look like, and have you come up and give, kind of a philosophical viewpoint of it and why all of it's really important. And then we could kick that off from there.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to do it.
Okay. Awesome, brother. Well, let me pray for you on your travels, and that way.
You've been listening to the Man Up God's Way podcast. Visit us on Facebook, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, and our website at manupgodsway.org.